All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Thomas Halverson, and I'm the Associate Director for Corporate and Foundation Relations here at the Middle East Institute. I'd like to welcome you all to another session in MEI's virtual briefing series on the escalating conflicts in the Middle East, which this week will focus on China and its role in the region. Since October, MEI has been working hard to provide you with expert analysis on every dimension of the ongoing conflicts in the region in the post-October 7th world, and we hope that you found them to be a valuable resource over the last couple months. After today, invitations to join these live briefing calls will be restricted to better serve our corporate and individual members, as well as members of the press. If you found that these briefings are beneficial to your business or relevant to the work that you do, we encourage you to consider joining our membership community. I'd be more than happy to chat with you if you're interested. Feel free to send me an email, and I'd be happy to find time to chat. Without further ado, however, I am delighted to welcome two highly regarded experts on China to today's session. John Calabrese is a senior fellow at MEI and a professor of international relations at American University. And Yoon Soon is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center and a co-director of their East Asia program and a director of their China program, as well as a close friend of MEI. Thank you both for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Before we get to our question and answer session, I'd like to invite you both to provide our listeners with a better understanding of how China is reading and reacting to the escalation of conflict and tension in the Middle East since October 7th. In particular, I'm hoping you can address three main points. First, I'd love to get your impression on how China views the ongoing war in Gaza, how it's affecting China's relations with Israel and Palestine, and how China is interpreting the conflict from the perspective of shifting regional geopolitics. Second, I'd like to hear both of your opinions on China's reaction to threats in the Red Sea and threats to pressing global commerce issues. And finally, I'd love to get your impression on how all of this and more in the Middle East affects China's calculus in its long-term greater geopolitical strategy. How does China see the Middle East as something? Does China see the Middle East as something it can avoid? What are China's most valuable assets in the region? And how does this all affect its competition with the United States in the months and years ahead? That's a lot, but hopefully we'll get to it all over the course of this call. I think it's all something we're all very interested in hearing about. So, John, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Yoon afterwards.
Sure. Thanks, Thomas, for inviting me. It is a packed set of questions, and I hope that I can offer some insight or at least provoke some questions. So I think when the conflict began, there were probably many people who expected China to play a robust, impactful diplomatic role. And I think those expectations had some basis. First of all, given China's extensive economic stakes in the region and its growing diplomatic profile and activities in the region, I think that was probably responsible for some of the expectation. Second, at least as I understand it, and I think that Yoon can correct me if I'm wrong, over the last couple of years, in terms of the evolution of China's foreign policy, there seems to have been a shift away from the somewhat self-inflicted wounds of wolf warrior diplomacy toward a greater effort to present China as a constructive player with positive contributions and numerous initiatives on the diplomatic side, whether that was in unveiling the Global Development Initiative or Global Security Initiative. So I think that kind of activism and assertiveness, I think, maybe led some people to believe that China would play a more impactful role. And the third, which I'm sure that people who are more conversant in Middle East affairs would have recognized, is that China played a very helpful role in brokering the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. My take on this is that after several months, I think those expectations were pretty much dashed or at least disappointed. I think that maybe predictably for some, but maybe not so predictably for others, China's played a pretty cautious diplomatic role. And I would say that China's diplomacy with respect to the conflict can be characterized as more rhetorical posturing than, the development and deployment of a, carefully crafted mediation strategy. If I had to choose a label that might portray or represent how China's played its hand, I'd say that I'd call it pro-Palestinian neutrality. And that pro-Palestinian neutrality, I think, has certain familiar features for those of us, at least, who kind of follow this over the years. Feature number one is, the expression of sympathy and solidarity with the Palestinians. Feature number two, which at least was expected from me, was that China came out as a pretty early proponent of a ceasefire. Feature number three was that China and Chinese diplomats reaffirmed what had been their long-held support for the establishment of a Palestinian state and a two-state solution based on pre-1967 borders and a capital in East Jerusalem. And the final feature, which I think is interesting and does have some unfamiliar or maybe new terrain characteristics to it, is that I think China played its hand or, concentrated its diplomacy with specific attention and emphasis on its role as a UN Security Council member. It's in the UN where China, I think, its profile was the largest. Its voice was the loudest, but in some ways, even the hand that it played in the UN Security Council is sort of reminiscent of the way that it dealt with the Syria civil war, where it acted, more or less formally or informally in tandem with Russia, trading vetoes with the United States. So in terms of what you might call like unfamiliar features of China's response to the conflict, I think that, there was a month, and that month coincided, the month was November, it coincided with China holding its rotating presidency of the UN Security Council. And there, I think China's approach was very interesting. I think on full display, you saw China not only seeking to prove its pro-Palestinian and pro-Arab bona fides, right, but also to promote itself as the so-called Global South's champion of an alternative world order, and to highlight the West's double standards in its response. And so in that respect, I think that was something that I hadn't seen as prominent a feature of China's diplomacy as maybe in other cases and other circumstances previously. To move to your second question, Thomas, on its reaction to Red Sea threats, there I have a few observations, and I'm sure that Yoon will have more of them and probably higher quality ones as well. I think that this came at an inopportune time for China. The economy is, in a doldrums. The last thing that China needed was a disruption or heightened risks to its maritime commerce. And so, obviously, I don't think that, the Houthi missile attacks on marine traffic in the Red Sea was a welcome development for China, of course, any more than it is for anybody with important stakes in maritime commerce. And I do think that China shared some other kind of concerns and cost burdens, for one, rising shipping costs and insurance rates. But interestingly enough, I think that China so far has managed to weather some of these risks and dangers. It could be blind luck, or maybe not, that Chinese ships that have transited the Red Sea have not been targeted, or at least have not been struck. Interestingly enough, whereas some of the larger container operations, Chinese container operations, have, like many of their foreign counterparts, had to traverse the Cape of Good Hope, adding 10, 12 days and associated costs to their operations. Interestingly, there are at least 2 or 3 lesser known but significant Chinese shippers that have begun or increased their operations through the Red Sea. And so to some extent, that's offset some of the costs and expenses associated with the dangers. Another thing that I've seen reported, but I have no way of confirming this, nor of indicating like how frequent and what the extent is, and that is that some Chinese flagged vessels have been accompanied by PLAN or Chinese naval escorts. I think that's very interesting. I think another interesting development has been that there's been a spike in demand for overland transport of freight from China to Europe, both through the Russian corridor and through the Middle Corridor. And so I think that's very interesting. Another interesting development is that China declined to participate in the United States, multilateral effort, which I think is called something like Operation Prosperity Guardian. But, I mean, I don't think that that is such a unexpected or, how would you say, exceptional development when you understand that when you look at how many regional participants, for example, there are in that, multilateral or multinational flotilla, I think Bahrain is the only participant. And I think that, prematurely it was declared that, most or many of the United States' major European allies were going to participate. But unless I'm mistaken, France, Italy, and Spain decided not to participate, I think, on the grounds that they wouldn't agree or were skittish about, operating under U.S. command. So I think what I see having happened in the Red Sea is that, and in fact, what I see having happened in the diplomatic scene with with respect to the ongoing conflict is that, the United States is playing the predominant role. The predominant role, security role in the Red Sea, the predominant diplomatic role in trying to negotiate the various dimensions of how to play or play out the conflict. And that China has been pretty much a marginal actor with a very, peripheral or, less than what I would call significant impact in shaping either the dynamics or specific outcomes. The final question, I guess you asked about, if I have a minute, I'll just use a minute. And that is, can China avoid the Middle East, I guess is the question, right? And the answer to that is no. I mean, China is tethered to the Middle East, and in some ways, the Middle East is tethered to China. That's particularly true when it comes to the Gulf, and the reason for that today is just like the reason for it, 20 years ago, which is that oil still matters to the Chinese economy. And the, 40 or 45% of the crude oil that China consumes and imports are from Gulf producers. I don't think that that's going to change anytime soon. I think to some extent, the game has changed because of China's purchases of hydrocarbons from Russia, but that's true more to the extent, sorry, it's true more with respect to natural gas imports than crude oil imports. So I think that's important. I also think that, since the establishment of the Belt and Road Initiative, the interlacing of the Chinese economies and Gulf economies in particular, but Middle Eastern economies writ large, goes far beyond oil. So the investments, assets, workers, all of those things have taken on a scale and significance and scope that they hadn't had before. And I don't think that, I think that China recognizes that there are risks as well as opportunities that are presented by, regional developments, including, unfortunately, tragic ones like the Israel-Gaza conflict. So I'll leave it there, turn it over to Yoon, and I hope and I know that she'll be much more effective in fielding your questions than I've been.
Thanks so much. Yoon, please.
Thank you, John. I'm flattered, and thank you, Thomas, for the invitation to be here. So I'll just cut to the chase. How China approaches the Palestine-Israel issue Well, I think John got it pretty right. It's a pro-Palestine neutrality. Although I would say that if you look at the Chinese official statement about this, the Chinese foreign minister said publicly during his meeting with Arab foreign ministers, said on this particular issue, we are on your side. End of the story. So it's a pretty clear position that China does pick a side. So the neutrality side is a little downplayed by that statement. I would like to think that the Gaza crisis should serve as a wakening up call for Israel because it does reflect, in my view, a certain level of romanticization about China before the Gaza crisis, right? Israel had all these expectations, what China would say, what China should say, and how China should play an honest role and say things honestly. That did not happen. And I think it should be clear or made clear to Israel that it will not happen down the road either. So China's position on the Palestine-Israel issue is very clear, is very firm. And the Chinese, I think the Chinese, what they probably want to tell the Israelis is, well, don't force us to choose. Because when you force us to choose, our choice is not going to be you. So moving forward, how Israel will re-strategize on their China strategy and to recalibrate I would say a more effective approach to China. I think that will be a tremendous question for Israel to answer. And of course, both the Gaza crisis and the Red Sea crisis, the Chinese answer is, well, two-state solution, right? Well, easier said than done, but China does not have a concrete plan as for how it can be done, but it will not stop China from going back to the original solution, which is two-state. And China has used that talking point quite a bit in the Red Sea crisis because the Chinese argument is, well, Red Sea crisis is basically a derivative of the Gaza crisis. If you want this to de-escalate, you will have to de-escalate first in Gaza. And I think embedded in both crises, or China's approach to both crises, is a deep dissatisfaction with or a challenge to U.S. position or U.S. biased position in the region. And the Chinese understand very well that the region has less and less appetite for that U.S. position. So using this opportunity either actively or subconsciously to bleed the U.S. leadership and credibility in the region is something that's not China's creation, but I think China would like to see. In terms of the Red Sea crisis, well, so far, I would say that the Chinese approach has been relatively detached. Why? Because it has not come to affect China's economic interests critically. So we know that the Houthis said, "Oh, we're not going to target Chinese ship," and the Chinese reaction was, "Well, we hope that you can identify which one is our ship." But for China, I think even in their calculus, the most affected area will be international shipping, right? But even if for the ship that has to take the longer route through the Cape of Good Hope, they calculate that it's only not only it's an inflated price or inflated cost of 29% plus $4 per ton. So in their calculus, this is not too significant yet to generate a much more harsh reaction from the Chinese side. This could change. We know that the Chinese convey the message that Iran should not try to escalate the situation, but I don't believe that message was combined or composed of any tacit or explicit warning to Iran that what will happen to China's policy if Iran does choose to escalate. So just conveying the message, like John said, is more rhetorical in a way. But I'm sure the Iranians will take the message because currently China remains potentially, I would say, the single most important importer of Iranian oil despite the sanctions. So if the situation escalates and the oil production and transportation through the region becomes affected by the crisis, I think the Chinese will take a much more hands-on and proactive approach to do more. Great power competition in the Middle East. So far, what we're seeing is, I would say that it's a mismatch of the great power competition. China is playing a bigger role in the economic field, there's no doubt. But U.S. remains to be the sole security provider or the security guarantor in the region. So we see that the two powers are playing their roles in two very different ways and in two very different arenas. And what does it mean? I think it means that, well, for the Americans, the question is, well, China, you import 53% of your crude oil from the region. Aren't you concerned that we can shut it down? And I think that's a question that the Chinese have thought very deeply about, and their answer is no, not really. We're susceptible to the threat, but we're not vulnerable to the threat. Because for you to shut down the Strait of Hormuz and shut down the Chinese energy transportation is going to have much bigger repercussion across your allies in Asia who also import oil from the region, and also your allies in the region who produces oils that we purchase. So coming to Thomas' question, what is China's biggest asset in the region? I would say China's biggest asset is the fact that China is the largest customer of the Middle Eastern oil. And that carries a lot of implications. That means that China sees itself as a customer. And we know that, well, last year, John mentioned that Russia surpassed Saudi as a top supplier of oil to China. And it was a pretty large margin. It's almost 20 to 25% bigger than the oil import by China from Russia was 20 to 25% larger than is imported from Saudi. So it's very significant. So China is trying to diversify its oil origins. But at the same time, Middle East remains to be a region that China cannot be freed from. And the region most likely does not want to be freed from the Chinese demand either, because before Saudi could embark on its Vision 2030, there's still this bridging period that countries in the region still rely on their oil and export. In terms of the great power competition, what does that mean? My conclusion, and I have a piece coming out about this. My conclusion is that China is not trying to replace the United States in the region because it knows it can't. China's current defense budget is around somewhere around 240 billion US dollars. And the Chinese calculus says US military spending in the region alone is 75 billion US dollars a year. And remember, Middle East is not China's primary theater. China's primary theater is West Pacific, and Taiwan is the biggest single most important issue, which means that China does not have the defense budget to maintain or to build a military presence in the region, nor does China want to. So China is not trying to replace the United States as a security provider or security guarantor in the region, but China is trying to displace the US-led system. With what? Well, with what the Chinese call the multilateral regional security dialogue platform. So in the Chinese view, the future security of Middle East should be managed by Middle Eastern countries, not by China and not by the United States. And China, remember the asset question, China as a large customer of the Middle Eastern oil has tremendous influence through that process. So my conclusion is, no, China is not trying to replace the United States, but yes, China is trying to displace the United States. Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted there. Thanks so much, Yoon and John, for your analysis, and I'm looking forward to seeing what questions come up from our audience. At this time, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the raise hand function in Zoom and keep your hand raised until I call and unmute you. Then kindly state your name and affiliation and direct your question to one or both of our scholars on the call. Questions can also be submitted in writing using the Q&A chat box on Zoom. To kick things off, though, I'll start with a question. Yoon, you touched on it briefly, but something that I'd love to talk a little bit more about on this call is China's relationship with Iran. We've heard in some of our past briefing sessions here that a lot of the escalating tensions in the region, in the Red Sea and in Israel, Palestine, in Syria and Iraq, are leading slowly but surely to a greater confrontation between Iran and Israel and the US. My question to you is, how does China view Iran's role in the region, and how would it react if tensions were to continue to escalate along those lines? I suppose, Yoon, let's start with you. Thanks.
Okay, that's a great question. We know that the Chinese approach to the region generally is a balancing act, right? They see that Iran, some Chinese scholars say there are three camps in the Middle East. There are the allies of the United States, and then there's resistance led by Iran, and then there's more the what they call the 3M countries, the modern Muslim and modern moderate Muslim countries, the 3M countries, and they would like to say that Turkey is one of them. So for China, the balancing approach pretty much predetermined that China is not going to pick one over the other, especially between Iran and Saudi. We see that the Chinese Balancing Act, Chinese leader visits Saudi, and then someone else, another Chinese leader will visit Iran. The Saudi crown prince visit Beijing, and then President Raisi will visit Beijing as well. So it's a pretty well calculated balancing act between the Shiite and Sunni, between Iran and the Gulf countries. But it's a different angle. What you raised is the relationship between Iran and the United States. And there, I think the primary, from the Chinese perspective, the primary challenge has always been JCPOA, which Trump administration pulled out of, right? So coming to the Iran nuclear issue, I'm afraid that Chinese talking point is always going back to the JCPOA, that when is U.S. going to renegotiate, when the U.S. is going to come back to the multilateral negotiated approach with Iran. I don't think that Chinese want to see a war or escalation of tension. Well, escalation of tension is probably okay, but they don't want to see an active conflict in the region, which will disrupt oil production and transportation. But I don't think the Chinese will solely place responsibility of such an escalation on Iran either. Last but not least, let me mention the economic aspect of it. Well, a few years ago, China and Iran reached that 25-year blueprint of, I believe it was a lot of money. It was like $160 billion for 25 years. Or I need to double check the number. But what we're seeing since that deal was signed in 2021 is nothing has really transpired in reality. And if you look at Raisi's visit to Beijing last year, well, I would say that he brought with him a lot of cabinet members who are responsible for economic development, but they did not harvest the deals and the cooperation that they would like to see. So the Chinese are still extremely cautious about investing either in oil or non-oil asset in Iran because they're concerned about the international sanction. They're concerned about the prospect of JCPOA coming back, and Iran suddenly has more Western partners available, and the Chinese will no longer appear to be the most attractive one. There are a lot of concerns about the Chinese economic future in Iran, which is why we're not seeing a lot of concrete agreements being signed. But at the same time, I would say the Chinese are buying oil from Iran, but mostly through Malaysia. If you look at Malaysia, Malaysia has been top 5 of oil exporters to China in the past 2 years. And you wonder that, well, Malaysia, you're not an oil producing country. Where did you get the oil? So it's mostly the transit of Iranian oil and Venezuela oil, and we know that. So I would say that China is keeping Iran on life support, maintaining its economic influence over Iran's decision making, but at the same time, not giving Iran everything that Iran wants. So the strategic alignment is there, and I think the concern about the potential escalation is also real. It just has not come true yet.
That's great. John, anything you'd like to add?
I mean, that was great. And I think I'd add just 2 points. One is that Iran needs China more than China needs Iran. And 2, I think I could be mistaken, but I think that, it's kind of ironic or paradoxical that China doesn't want to see a conflict break out in which, a full-fledged conflict, but at the same time, I think China has very little leverage or ability to restrain either Iran on the one hand or the United States on the other. And connecting that point with the diplomatic process, such as it is in Israel-Gaza conflict, there too, China doesn't have the leverage. In a way, it's like, on the one hand, it's blaming the United States, and there might be sufficient reason to do that. But on the other hand, it depends on the United States. So I find those kind of, I don't know what you'd like to call them, like ironies or contradictions, kind of interesting. And I think that they apply to the role of Iran in the region as well.
Can I just add a 2-finger to that? I think John got it really, really great. It's a paradox. On one hand, you see that China criticizing U.S. for being the source of instability in the region, But on the other hand, China is also free riding. Well, Chinese won't say that it's free riding because U.S. would do this regardless of whether China is there. So U.S. is doing its policy in the region for its own good, but not for China's good, right? So, but from the U.S. perspective, China is free riding from the security benefits that U.S. is providing. So on one hand, China criticizes the United States. On the other hand, China also enjoys benefit from the United States. And that leads to the interesting question, because we saw, I think the most resemblance case is Afghanistan. We saw the same thing. China was saying that, well, every chaos and all the instability was because of the U.S. war in Afghanistan. And when U.S. packed up and left, the Chinese freaked out. And how dare you leave so irresponsibly and leaving the inferno of potential security threats to the region, to the countries in the region, right? So I think this actually reflects the reality of the great power competition as we see it. So U.S. will be damned in the Chinese narrative either way. So I would say that the U.S. should do its own calculus instead of looking at the Chinese narrative, because Chinese narrative is always going to be critical of the United States. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. That's great analysis. It looks like we have a question here in the chat. It's from an anonymous attendee. Considering the interests of both the U.S. and China in maintaining stable petroleum prices and supply and desire to maintain safe trade lanes through the region, is there any prospect of the U.S. and China cooperating to contain and settle regional tensions in the Middle East? Is there an opportunity for the two governments to accept a shared responsibility for international stability in a multipolar world rather than competitors in this case? John, let's start with you.
I mean, I think the two have shared interests. I think it's a great question, but you know, it's one of those situations where how do you get from here to there? The fact that you have shared interests does not necessarily mean that that you're willing, or for that matter, necessarily able to coordinate policies. I mean, the Red Sea situation is kind of interesting, right? Because I mean, there is a shared interest, and there's also a precedent for you know, naval cooperation or coordination. I mean, you may recall that in the, you know, counter-piracy operations off the coast of Somalia, the U.S. and China were, you know, more or less you know, conducting joint operations. And so it's not like that, you know, that this can't be done, and it's not like it shouldn't be done. But I guess my question, I punt this one to Yun, is, you know, what are the obstacles? And it could be that the relationship, the bilateral relationship, has spiraled downward or deteriorated across a whole range of issues to an extent that neither side really can find its way to build on this shared interests, to undertake, like, you know, concrete cooperative steps.
Well, U.S.-China cooperation is possible, but only on lowest common denominator issues. Anything about that, I wouldn't hold my breath. Well, the challenge is, yes, there's a convergence of interest between U.S. and China on stability in the region, but there's also a divergence between U.S. and China on their individual national interests in the region. And here, cooperation, I think the more helpful framing of while looking at state-to-state cooperation is you look at the absolute gains versus relative gains. So yes, absolute gains will be peace and stability in the region, and that applies to both. But how about the relative gains and also relative losses? So what U.S. will have to do, what political capital U.S. will have to pay, for example, to rein in Israel, and what economic or political capital China will have to pay to rein in Iran. And these are, when we talk about collaboration, when we talk about U.S. and China each individually play their role, these roles are not cost-free. And we're not able to play those roles here because of the political capital that's required with or without China. With China, it could potentially make it more complicated, because people will be saying that, hey, we are sacrificing our American national interest and China free rides with the security that we create. So not to say that this should not happen, but I won't hold my breath over the prospect of really significant substantive solutions to the regional crisis. But again, coming back to the lowest common denominator is always cost and benefits analysis, right? If the benefit is so significant, meaning that war has broken out, nobody gets oil, and the regional stability is completely disrupted, I think that will push Beijing and Washington to come together and figure out a more forceful approach and more proactive solution to the region. But anything short of that, we're basically seeing two countries doing their own calculus. Oh, here's what I have to gain, but here's what I have to lose. So maybe I don't want to do it. And the example that John raised about Somalia, yes, China has been conducting naval escort missions in the Gulf of Aden since 2008. Why is China not doing that in the Red Sea? Because there's no UN mandate. The counter-piracy naval escort mission operation was mandated by UN Security Council resolution in 2008. And there's no such Security Council resolution on the issue of Red Sea, and I bet there won't be. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both. Just as a reminder to everybody, to ask a question, you can raise your hand and I'll allow you to speak and ask your question live. You can also ask it in the chat. In the meantime, I have another question, and it piggybacks on some of the comments that you guys made in your opening remarks. It seems like in the Middle East, the U.S. has a monopoly on sort of security and the military aspect, and China has a monopoly more or less on, or it has the upper hand on the economic aspect as the top customer. What can you guys speak to about both countries' competition in the political realm and the narrative building realm? Obviously, we said that you mentioned that China has a compelling narrative to make, you know, and a case to make on behalf of the Palestinians. The U.S. has a long history in the Middle East. How do you see those playing out? And do you see those important to long-term geopolitical competition in the region, having an upper hand when it comes to relationship building and sort of political relationship building in the region?
I can give it a try, and then John can correct me. I think the political system aspect of the relationship between China and the Middle East is getting more and more significant, especially in terms of when we look at the political relations between U.S. and these countries. And I remember at the conference I hosted last summer, I believe, the former commander or the deputy commander of SETCOM basically said, well, our biggest problem in the Middle East is that our politicians keep criticizing our allies. And where do you think our allies will run? Of course, they will align their positions with China. And here, I do think that the Chinese lack of regards for liberal democracy or the political system plays a pretty powerful role in strengthening and consolidating relationship with countries in the region. What do you call, well, the convergence of authoritarianism? That's what some people would call it. And there's some truth to it, but it carries a lot of currency.
John, anything you'd like to add? Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. I don't think that it's just merely I don't think it's just merely the fact that you know, let's just say there's a democracy deficit in both China and most Middle Eastern countries. But I think there is a tacit, if not explicit, mutual understanding and commitment not to interfere in each other's domestic political affairs. And I think that China welcomes silence on issues related to certain matters internally, and I think that the same is true in the Middle East. But that's at the, elite or government level. I also think, I mean, to some extent, public opinion does matter, even in authoritarian systems. And I think in this conflict, the way that China has expressed itself and its sympathy and its solidarity, the way that Foreign Minister Wang has come out, I think probably in an unprecedented way, and said publicly that China is concerned about and opposes Israel's collective punishment of Palestinians. I think that those remarks and those kinds of attitudes, that ability to, in a way, claim the moral high ground, I think that, that probably resonates. Again, I'm not so sure, how long lasting that resonance will be, or how it might ultimately affect, decision-making. But I do think that, those are maybe positive inroads on the political scene that China has made by taking the position that it has.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both. We have another question here in the chat from Sylvia Samore. She asks, what are the impacts you see of the current situation in the Belt and Road initiatives and in other multilateral contexts China is a part of, in particular BRICS and SCO? John, do you want to take a stab at it, and then Yoon?
It'll be a stab. It's a good question. I don't see any direct positive or negative impact. I mean, the basic thrust of the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, has already. I think there's been a revamping or a revision of the way in which the Belt and Road projects, their size, their scope. I think that's already happened. I think that is sort of dissociated from or not connected in any way to the current developments. I do think, though, interestingly enough, I mean, China has moved toward, at least in the memos that I've seen, and in the statements that have been made, toward kind of like new frontiers of cooperation in technology, in space, and in all of those things. And I'm not too sure that the conflict is necessarily going to either in the short or longer term disrupt or undermine those efforts.
If anything, I would say that we're probably going to see the strengthening of cooperation between China and the Gulf countries.
Mm.
Israel was not I don't think Israel has been regarded as a key member of Belt and Road anyway, but I do feel that, I do believe that Israel's recalculation will be manifesting itself in the future policies. But now China has pledged basically a support to the Arab world, to the Gulf countries, to their position on Palestine issue. I think the strengthening of the political solidarity is going to manifest in economic arena as well. In terms of BRICS and SCO is primarily Central Asia. I haven't seen SCO playing a big role in the Middle East. In terms of BRICS, people always say that, BRICS, all these emerging markets and new countries creating these international organizations. And I think a cynic would say that, yeah, but what have they done? Having more members, having more discussions, and get together every year and to talk about what how they're not happy with the current international system, but unable to strike a consensus among themselves as well what a new system should look like. Well, it is important, right? It's important that countries like UAE and Saudi and Egypt are now included in BRICS. So it's expanding membership, but on the Gaza crisis, I don't see any role being played by BRICS.
That's a good point. We have another question here in the chat. Do Middle East governments put pressure on China over their treatment of Uyghur Muslims?
Well, I mean, if their public silence is any indication, the answer is no. Mm-hmm. And I think I'd go back to, what I said earlier, which is, I think that there is a tacit, if not an explicit mutual commitment to stay out of one another's business to the extent possible. And I think the only country where both domestic public opinion and at the kind of elite or leadership level where the treatment of the Uyghurs has been a thorny or vexing issue is the case of Turkey. But other than Turkey, I can't think of another government or any part of a government in the Middle East that's been even mildly critical. Again, maybe behind closed doors, but I have no way of believing that that's the case, and I'd be skeptical if it were.
So a little bit of, if you go back to history, in 2009, after the Urumqi riot of on July 5th, some ayatollahs in Iran had been critical of China.
Right.
And then in 2014, another example is ISIS actually singled China out for the treatment of our Muslim brothers. So that was a one-time reference, which raised a lot of red flags for the Chinese. So those are the two public displeasures that we've seen from the region about China's Uyghur issue. Under the surface, there have been other examples of tacit support of not necessarily direct, not necessarily explicit criticism of China, but more implicit support of the Uyghur population. Like, for example, you might recall that back in 2013 and 2014, the Chinese were vigorously asking Southeast Asian countries like Thailand and Cambodia to deport who they believe are Uyghur populations, Uyghur refugees that were left in Southeast Asia. Turns out they all carry Turkish passports. And the question is, well, where did they get Turkish passports? So that was an issue that the Chinese government very vigorously fixed with Istanbul. We also see that the countries like Saudi, Qatar, UAE, and Egypt providing religious studies to Uyghur population, Uyghur Muslims in China, basically inviting them, take them out of China, and bring them to the region to do religious studies. So that issue had also been let's say that a little bit of a friction point between China and these countries, especially about the management of these religious students. But I think that issue has also gone away in the past. I haven't heard anything in the past 5 to 6 years. So yes, there is a history, but no, it is not a sticking point between China and the countries in the region at this moment.
That's
Countries
good.
in the region are very pragmatic, right?
Yeah.
That, yeah, well, you're not treating Uyghurs very well, but you're treating me really well. And you are my big customer in terms of oil, so I probably would just look other way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, thank you both. We're just coming up to our closing time, so I'm going to wrap things up now. But if anybody has any more questions, please email them to me. I'd be happy to send them over to John and Yoon to answer at a later time. I hope you'll join me in thanking both John and Yoon for participating in this week's session on China. We really appreciate your insight and your willingness to share your morning with us. If you've missed any of our sessions or wish to catch them again, you can find them on our website along with transcripts at www.mei.edu/briefing-series. It's www.mei.edu/briefing-series. Thanks again for joining us for this week's session, and be on a lookout for an invitation to next week's briefing in the coming days. If you find these calls valuable and want to learn more about other resources MEI can provide, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to connect. Thank you all, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.